I'm Steve Kraske, and this is Up to Date. By 1919, much of Europe lay in ruins in the aftermath of World War I. But prior to that conflict, with three European empires ruled by the kingly cousins, most people thought war to be nearly impossible. This hour, historian Charles Emmerson takes us through the year 1913 and the months leading up to the Great War. From the capitals of Europe to Washington, D.C., we'll view the world as it was 100 years ago in all its richness and complexity. We'll discuss how the seeds of modern globalization and imperial nationalism were forced together and how our world may not be so different today. We'll get you up to date after this hour's news. Welcome to Up to Date. I'm Steve Kraske. The question that Charles Emerson's new book on the year 1913 raises is, was the world all that different from what it is today? Yes, we're talking 100 years ago, and the year just before the Great War, or World War I, began. But the world was blossoming that year, interconnected in ways it had never been before. Industry was booming. The automobile was coming to the masses. China was awakening from centuries of slumber. Japan was establishing itself as a great power. Capitalism reigned. And yet all that would not halt a world war that would claim 40 million lives and reshape the world landscape. Charles Emmerson tells a story in 1913 in search of the world before the Great War. He's an Australian-born writer who lives in London and a senior research fellow at Chatham House, working on resource security issues, foreign policy, and global geopolitics. He's also the author of The Future History of the Arctic. Charles, so good to have you here. Welcome to Kansas City.
Thank you very much indeed, Steve.
And thanks for surviving a harrowing trip from the airport here, too. You're still in one piece.
Indeed, absolutely.
Not a bad thing. Well, this is a sprawl of a book that takes the reader from Washington to London to Paris to Constantinople. How did you wrap your arms around something quite as epic as the world on the eve of the Great War? Because you took a bite of the apple here and bites of about 22 other apples here, too, it seems to me.
Well, that's true. I mean, the great advantage I had was that I was only looking at 1 year. So in one sense, it was focused on those 12 months. But of course, you realize that as soon as you start looking at a 12-month period, all the things that happen in that year, you have to look back to understand how those things happen, why those things happen, and of course, why they were important. So I started off with a narrow focus, and then, of course, as things do, things ended up expanding. And in terms of the cities, which are really at the very much the core of the book,
yes, right.
There were a few cities that in 1913 you couldn't avoid writing about. You couldn't avoid writing about London
Sure.
or Berlin or Paris or Washington or New York. But I also wanted to move beyond that to provide a truly global portrait of the world.
Winnipeg.
Exactly.
Of all places.
Winnipeg. Well, I had a Canadian friend who essentially ran a guerrilla campaign
Yeah, I was gonna say.
for Winnipeg to be included. But the thing is that he was actually completely right. For two reasons. First, that Winnipeg was this real boomtown of the British Empire in 1913. It was viewed as being very much a city of the future. And indeed, if you go to Winnipeg now, you'll see a lot of very, very grand buildings built around that time, 1912, 1913. And of course, it's not quite so optimistic a place now. But at that time, it was viewed as being potentially one of the great cities of the 20th century.
Well, did you wind up visiting all these cities in the course of doing this book? Because if that's the case, I want your gig. I mean, that sounds pretty good.
Well, I would like that too. No, sadly, I couldn't visit all of them. I mean, I have visited most of them at some point. But there were places I couldn't get to. I couldn't get to Tokyo, for example. I couldn't get to Buenos Aires, more's the pity. But I have been to most of them and was able to conduct a lot of research either in London or in other cities or remotely, of course.
Did it ever feel like the whole project was sort of becoming, too big, too sprawling?
Often, yeah. I mean, often it felt that the project was becoming difficult. But then you've got these great sources. You've got diaries. You've got newspapers. You've got great writing which already exists about the cities in this time, and I think that brings you right back to focus in the city at that time. And so the virtue of constructing it around cities was that you felt you were constantly coming back to real places, and yeah. that was great.
You know, a lot of readers, Charles, are going to assume that this is a book of gloomy foreboding. And what you find out reading this book is that's not the case at all. How surprising was that to you?
Well, it was one of the key reasons for writing the book.
Yes.
was not to write a book of gloomy foreboding, because very often when people think about the years before the First World War, the years before the Great War, very often they describe that world in terms of, the onset of war, as if everyone was walking around with a time bomb or a clock ticking in their head,
right,
just waiting to go off in 1914. And the reality, of course, is that there were many other narratives around the world. There were different ideas of the future, and indeed war was a possibility. People spoke about it, but they didn't think that the war that might happen would be the war that did happen. And many thought the war couldn't happen because the world was becoming more globalized. It was becoming more internationalized in terms of flows of people, trade, ideas, etc. So I very much wanted to pose a different view of the world in 1913.
And of course, you say all that, and myself, and I assume some of my listeners are thinking to themselves right now, well, you're describing the world today. And so you can't help but wonder, are you, predicting here some of the same sort of cataclysmic results that you found 100 years ago?
Well, I think that's true, and I think it's unavoidable that there are some parallels between 1913 and 2013. And I don't want to draw those too strongly. I'm not suggesting that in 2013 we're just on the cusp of a new world war. But I think what is very important to recognize is that in 1913, an era of great globalization, many people believed that even if a war happened, that these processes of globalization, of the world being pulled closer together by technology, that these were processes which would just continue. They couldn't stop.
Yeah.
And they did. And I think now, similarly, at a time of geopolitical tension, geopolitical shifts around the world, there is, I think, a possibility of being a little bit lazy in the way we think about how the future is going to play out.
Yeah. It's so interesting. This is not a book that discusses very much at all about what caused the start of World War I. You really sort of strike a glancing blow to that and move on. But what's interesting to me about what you do say about the start of World War I is you say quite conclusively that we don't know how the damn thing started. It just started. And there are lots of different theories as to what happened here. But even today, 100 years later, we don't exactly know for sure.
We don't exactly know, and there are lots of books which are written about the lead up to World War I, if you like. Very few of them are called the reasons for World War I. They're often called things like origins, which implies a rather less clear line of causality between things that were in the air, things that were happening, and what actually ended up happening in 1914.
Yeah.
And there will be lots of books written about this, but very often they can't come to a neat conclusion because at the end of the day, it was something which happened and which even people at the time, many people, did not expect.
Yeah, and it's just like firecrackers going off, and we don't know exactly who struck the first match to light the first firecracker here.
Well, it's what if you want to point the finger of blame, then you can point the finger of blame at many different people, at the rise of nationalism, at individuals, at military staffs. You can at Germany, some people pointed at Russia, some people at England. So it's possible to find lots of people to blame. I think what you generally find when there are so many potential candidates for the reasons or those who were responsible for it is that probably it's a mixture of all of these.
And again, one other theme that you really strike throughout this book, and again, it's hard for folks maybe to wrap their arms around, but it's this idea that we're talking about 1913, we're talking about 100 years ago, and so many people look at those days as something out of this, so far distant past, they can't even begin to relate to it. But one of your themes here is that the world in 1913 was incredibly modern. It was a world that we could, in many ways, relate to today.
Absolutely. I mean, the world of 1913 was already a world where you had automobiles and where you had energy geopolitics, which was associated with that. It was already a world where you had airplanes buzzing around in the sky. I mean, the first flight was only 10 years old, and yet by 1913, you'd actually had the first aerial bombing in the world. So, the world was moving very, very quickly. There was a sense of acceleration, a sense of dynamism about it. Mm-hmm. And of course, America was very much a part of that story as well.
Yeah. Whenever someone writes a book like this, again, that's as sprawling as this one is, I mean, I'm sure there's a place or two you would have just died to have been for a few days to sort of get a sense of what was happening in that city at that time. Where would you like to have been? I'm sure London probably comes to mind pretty quickly.
Well, I'm from London, and in many respects, London hasn't necessarily changed that much between 1913 and 2013. So London actually probably wouldn't be on my list.
That's interesting.
But I think it'd be a lot of fun to be in Paris in 1913. I guess it's always fun to be in Paris.
It's always fun to be in Paris, yeah.
I'd like to be in Constantinople in 1913, because that was a time when the capital of the Ottoman Empire was already in the middle of a war, actually, where the Ottoman Empire lost all of its European territory. But I think that would be a place where you could really touch much, much older history. And those layers of history would be very, very present in a place like Constantinople, as they are today.
And where is Constantinople?
Istanbul.
Istanbul. Yeah, that's what it is today.
Istanbul, not Constantinople, as the song goes. I'm not going to sing it.
Charles Emerson is our guest. We're talking about the year 1913 in search of the world before the Great War. If you want to join our conversation, as always, you can do so. 816-235-2888 is our phone number here. Our email address, uptodate at kcur.org, or you can tweet us at KCUR uptodate. Again, our number 816-235-2888. And I should point out that Charles Emmerson will speak about the world in 1913 at 6 this evening at the National World War I Museum in downtown Kansas City. This is in conjunction with the museum's special exhibition, Road to War, that chronicles the run-up to the start of the war 100 years ago next year. But Charles again speaks tonight at 6 at the National World War I Museum. Set the world stage for us in 1913, Charles. I mean, who are the big players? What are they doing? What's the general zeitgeist of the time? What's happening back then?
Well, look, this is very much a world of empires. Mm-hmm. It's a world which has been at peace, more or less, for the past 100 years, or at least Europe has been more or less at peace for the last 100 years. It's a world which has been transformed by urbanization and by industrialization in Europe, and also, of course, very much in the United States. The leading power of the age, without a doubt, is Britain, the United Kingdom.
And to look at a map of 1913 and to see exactly just how sprawling that empire was, I knew that, but to look at it on a map, it is pretty jaw-dropping.
It is pretty jaw-dropping, but actually the British influence actually went even broader than that. If you went, for example, to a place like Buenos Aires in Argentina in 1913, you'd find an outlet of Harrods, the great London department store in Buenos Aires in 1913. Huh. The head of the Argentinian Football Federation in 1913 was a Brit. So Britain, actually quite a small country, had this tremendous global influence and really was the linchpin of what appeared to be a relatively stable global economic system.
Yeah.
But there were question marks about how long, not the richest country in the world could actually remain the linchpin of this global system. And rising powers, of course, in Germany and in Japan, Russia booming tremendously in 1913, and of course the United States in that year, which had become a greatly powerful, greatly wealthy economic power, but had not yet converted that into political power at all.
An isolationist country at that time.
Well, and understandably so. I mean, there were lots of people in the United States then who saw the Atlantic and the Pacific as being, America's great protectors. America could develop separately from the rest of the world, great domestic market as well. But I think increasingly they were politicians and business people who realized that actually America couldn't just sign off and be separate from the rest of the world. And the United States was beginning to face the challenges of how it engaged with Mexico in the Civil War in Mexico. And of course, several years later, it would be faced with the challenge of, should it intervene or not in Europe? Was it acceptable to have a Europe which was run by the Germans?
This country had a new president in 1913.
Yes, Woodrow Wilson, talking about the new freedom. And indeed, many of the issues which were discussed in the United States in 1913 are familiar today. Mm-hmm. There was a big discussion about the relationship between Wall Street and Main Street. People railing about big corporations and how big corporations were squeezing the life out of smaller business and innovations across the United States.
Sounds familiar, doesn't it?
But the U.S. was not yet. It was sort of halfway between being a nation of villages and small towns So halfway between being that and being a city of great cities. So on the one hand, you have the skyscrapers of New York City. The Woolworth Building goes up in 1913. On the other hand, Washington D.C. is still a relatively small place. It's very much a city of the South. It's only 50 years since the end of the Civil War. So this is a real transition period in American history as well.
And just to put things in perspective, that same year, 1913, there was, a 50th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg held right here in this country. Lots of old vets getting together talking about that battle.
And it's quite striking if you can find photographs extraordinarily of the 50-year reunion in Gettysburg at which Woodrow Wilson spoke on July the 4th. And of course, he was the first elected Southern president since the Civil War. So this was a big deal. And you look at these black and white pictures of the Confederate soldiers and the Union soldiers, and you know what? Some of them don't look that old.
Yeah.
They really don't.
Yeah.
And there were 50,000 of them in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. So it really wasn't so long ago.
Who are some of the other 2 or 3 other leading figures on the world stage in 1913? People.
Well, one would be, I think, Kaiser Wilhelm in Germany, who's this rather fascinating, infuriating character. The German Kaiser. He's been on the throne for 25 years in Germany. He's sort of he's really an authoritarian. He wants to be loved. Really, he wants to be loved. I think that's what it comes down to. And he wants to make Berlin, the capital city of Germany, to be the grandest city in the world. His English grandmother was, of course, Queen Victoria. He looks over at Britain, which is, of course, the preeminent world power, and he kind of wants Germany to be a bit like Britain, but just a little bit better. So he's an infuriating and I think actually quite complex character as well. So he's one. Another character who I look at in the book and I find fascinating is Gandhi, who of course later would be the leader of the Indian independence movement. But in 1913, he's a British educated lawyer in South Africa, leading a campaign against discriminatory taxation in that part of the world. And this is really where he gets his start. So if you like, his rise towards being the leader of the Indian independence movement actually starts not in India at all, but in South Africa. So this, there's a very, very wide cast of characters, as you would imagine. But those two are, they're pretty interesting.
I want to talk about Vienna in just a moment. I want to get some phone calls here first. 816-235-2888 is our phone number here. Up to date at kcur.org is our email address. Charles Emmerson is our guest. We're talking about 1913, his new book, 1913 in Search of the World Before the Great War. Let's go to Richard from Olathe. Richard, you're on Up to Date. So nice to have you. Good morning. You there, Richard?
Hello?
Yes, go ahead, Richard.
Yes. I'm curious what your guest would comment on the development of the United States Federal Reserve in 1913 and how it possibly worked in with prior to World War I and even after World War I. Was the conception of the Federal Reserve I can't think of the right word, maybe an issue of concern? Was it something of great importance? Did it have a big change in the banking and the corporate system at the time?
But we just did a show on Woodrow Wilson a few weeks ago. Scott Berg was here with his new book. I think one of his great achievements was the founding of the Fed, right?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And this sort of goes back a bit to what I was saying earlier about the United States in 1913 not being a fully formed nation, if you like, being an adolescent nation in some respects. And the Federal Reserve, the foundation of the Federal Reserve, the establishment of the Federal Reserve in 1913 was one of these, I think, crucial markers, actually, to the United States becoming a more centralized nation in some respects, but also becoming a country which could convert economic power ultimately into political power.
Oh, okay.
Go ahead, Richard. Anything else?
No, that's about it. What about the Federal Reserve as we have it nowadays? Is there any correlation between what it was at that time and what it is now?
Well, of course, in 1913, you had to see what it was replacing. I mean, America had a financial crisis in 1907, which had essentially been settled in the offices of J.P. Morgan in New York City, where J.P. Morgan the most wealthy and most powerful financier of his age, had gathered all these other Wall Street types into his office and basically forced them to put more liquidity into the system. So it was very much focused around private individuals. And what the Federal Reserve did, of course, was to put to mix that up a bit with representatives of the state.
So institutionalized that system.
Institutionalize it, absolutely.
Yeah, okay. Richard, I'm glad you called. Thank you. Again, our number 816-235-2888 and our email address uptodate@kcur.org. What was happening in Vienna? Because all kinds of incredible world players are sort of gathering in Vienna very quietly in 1913.
Well, Vienna in 1913 is the capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which is this very odd empire that's been built up over centuries by, dynastic marriages, who's died when, battles in the mists of time, and as a result of which the empire is a sort of rather a sort of higgledy-piggledy construction, if I can say that. It's a place. It's a place where in different parts of the empire, people drive on different sides of the road. It's a very odd construct, and people speak many different languages. But it's also a place, therefore, which has it attracts a lot of people from outside. And so in Vienna in 1913, you have Trotsky, you have Hitler. You have Stalin visiting. Right. You have Freud. You have Wittgenstein. You have. I mean, it is an extraordinary city, but probably not a terribly hopeful city, because many people in Vienna in 1913 feel that power and wealth has kind of leached to these other European cities. Berlin is seen as the sort of the great German-speaking upstart in the German-speaking world, a far more dynamic capital, far more dynamic economy in Germany than in Austria-Hungary. But Vienna is an interesting place, and I try to recapture not only the sense of what's going on culturally and politically in Vienna at that time, but also the atmosphere. I mean, even if you go to Vienna now, you go to some of the cafes in Vienna, they really haven't terribly much changed.
And you must have just utterly immersed yourself in that era, in that history. How did you go about researching stuff 100 years ago and in these different cities? How did you get yourself so geared into the world of 1913, as you clearly did, Charles?
Well, it was very much it was immersive. I can't go back in time, but I can do the next best thing, which is to read what people were writing at that time. I mean, one thing I did, for example, for each of the cities was to just go and find a newspaper for each of those cities and go through it for the full 365 days of the year, and actually get a sense of what was on people's minds. And the interesting thing is
for the entire year for each city?
For the entire year. I mean, obviously, I wasn't reading absolutely every single article, but I think the point is you can actually get a quite good idea of what the main concerns were of people at that time just from reading the newspapers. And very often those would be quite different from those that we might expect. In other words, the possibility of a big international war. I mean, certainly that was present, but people worried about other things. In Britain, for example, in London, there was much more coverage of what was happening in Ireland, Home Rule in Ireland, and the possibility of a civil war in Britain, or of the suffragettes campaign. Or if you look through U.S. newspapers, again, the focus was very much on nation building at home, certainly not on the possibility of war abroad. So that was a good start.
And at what point during the course of 1913 did you begin to sense tension that could result in a spark that led to this conflagration that became World War I?
Well, it's always there. It's always there in the background. I mean, there is war in the Balkans in 1913, so it's happening on the European continent. But at the same time, the big powers, the big European powers, are getting together and trying to resolve it. Britain and Germany are coming really quite close in 1913. In May of that year, there is a royal wedding in Berlin where the daughter of the Kaiser is married.
Scene.
And you have the Kaiser of Germany, you have the Tsar of Russia, you have the King of England, and that was actually the last time those three would ever meet. But no one would have thought that at the time, or few people would have thought it at the time. So
and there was such a rush, you point out, to get newsreels about their meeting,
yes,
and get that film, rushed back to the States where it could be shown in theaters and, shown so people could see this great meeting.
Well, and this is, of course, cinema is a wonderful aspect of modernity in 1913, and cinema, not just in having short slapstick movies, but film as a propaganda tool as well. I mean, Woodrow Wilson makes a campaign movie in the 1912 presidential elections in the United States. In Russia in 1913, Tsar Nicholas II is celebrating 300 years of the Romanov dynasty, and there are films made to celebrate this, of course.
Yeah.
And yes, the idea of these films being rushed by fast train and fast steamer to be shown, it is a world which isn't so foreign to our own.
Yeah. And even when the Duke is assassinated, and there's this moment when you sense, and a lot of people point to that moment as the spark that sets off World War I. Did the media, was there a sense right away that something was terribly, terribly wrong that was going to result in what became World War I?
Well, remember, there'd been assassinations of very substantial political figures before, of presidents and princes. So it wasn't necessarily clear that this assassination would lead to a great European conflagration. In fact, at the time, you don't read the
papers and at that time and think, "Uh-oh, here we go."
Well, it might be front page news for one day, but it wasn't front page news necessarily the following day in all newspapers. So, it was of course a serious event. The heir to the throne of one of the great and oldest European powers is assassinated in Sarajevo, and essentially by suicide bombers, effectively. It's a big event. It'll be a big event now, but a lot of European leaders are on holiday. Not all of them rush back. Why should they? The diplomats will deal with it. There've been crises before. There've been crises where people have said, this is the one, but people have dealt with it. So why should this time be any different? And I think that great fundamental human, human question: why should this time be any different? That I think was very present in 1914.
What was the date of that assassination? What part of the year was it?
It was in June 1914.
So halfway in 14. So you're a year out.
Yes.
That's right. It's in 14. It's in 13. Okay. Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll continue our good conversation here with Charles Emmerson about his new book, 1913 in Search of the World Before the Great War. We'll take your questions at 816-235-2888 and at our email address uptodate at kcur.org. Again, Charles Emmerson speaks about the world in 1913 at 6 this evening at the National World War I Museum. More information about that on our website, kcur.org. I'm Steve Kraske of the Kansas City Star, and you're listening to Up to Date on KCUR. And we're back. I'm Steve Kraske. If you missed Friday's discussion of horror movies with the DVD gurus, you can find that and the weekend to-do list. Just go to kcur.org. Tomorrow on the show, Pulitzer Prize winner David Finkel joins us to talk about the impact military deployments have on families, especially when soldiers return home traumatized after serving overseas. Much of his book looks at Fort Riley out in the middle of Kansas. We'll visit with journalist David Finkel tomorrow on the show. This hour, our guest is Charles Emmerson. We're talking about the year 1913, 100 years ago, the last year of peace before the Great War begins, World War I. Charles Emerson's new book, 1913, In Search of the World Before the Great War. We're also joined now by Doran Cart. He's a senior curator at the National World War I Museum. The museum has a new exhibit titled Road to War, which explores the pivotal world events leading up to World War I. And Doran, nice to have you. Thanks for coming in today.
Thanks for having me, Steve.
What were some of the big pivotal events that begin to precipitate World War I? What does your exhibit show here?
Well, of course, we start with the 1904 because that was really the year of the Russo-Japanese War, and which was really probably the most modern war up to that date, with the use of technology, with the use of fleets,